All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Resuming Debate podcast. I'm your host, MP Garnett, and I just love this opportunity to have longer form, detailed conversations about big issues facing our country and the world. We're going to talk about Afghanistan today. After the September 11th, 2001 attacks on the United States, Canada and many other countries were actively involved in trying to bring about and support the development of democracy in Afghanistan. A great deal was spent. Canadian soldiers died in that effort, as did the soldiers and civilians from various other countries. And 20 years after, almost exactly 20 years after that, the Taliban again took over Afghanistan. And this is obviously very painful for the Afghan people and also for other countries that were involved in supporting that democratization process. But what's important for you to know and take from this episode, this discussion, is that the fight for freedom and democracy in Afghanistan is not over. There is, I think, a lot of pain and pessimism when people reflect on the efforts that were made, and nonetheless, the fact that the Taliban took control again. But the fight is not over. There is more that can be done. There are lessons that can be learned to help Afghanistan move forward in a positive way. And joining me for a discussion about that is Ali Nizari, the head of foreign relations for the National Resistance Front. Mr. Nizari, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me, Mr. Jennings. It's great to see you today.
Yes, thank you. So we've hosted you on Parliament Hill before, and I'm pleased to be able to help promote your message with a broader audience virtually. Could you tell us at the outset, what is the National Resistance Front? What are you trying to achieve? How are you operating? What's the nature of your organization?
It's truly an honor to be part of this podcast today. And to answer your first question, the National Resistance Front of Afghanistan is the last remaining democratic forces within the country. It's basically made up of the remnants of Afghanistan's military forces many who were trained by Canadians in the last 20 years. And so on August 15th, 2021, when the Republic of Afghanistan fell, the remnants of the military forces went to the north to a valley known as the Panjshir Valley, a very historic one that was able to resist against the Soviets and the Taliban and Al-Qaeda back in the 1990s. And so from that valley, the remnants of the former government, the military forces, and led by Mr. Ahmad Massoud, the son of the late Commander Ahmad Shah Massoud, who was assassinated 2 days prior to 9/11, declared the National Resistance Front of Afghanistan. These democratic forces, of course, the National Resistance Front of Afghanistan is made up of both military forces. It has a military wing, and at the same time, it has a political wing. The vision that we are struggling for is to establish a democratic, decentralized, pluralistic Afghanistan, where every single citizen, regardless of their race, regardless of their gender, and their ethnic background, will have equal rights in the future of the country. And so for the past almost 3 years now, we have been resisting the Taliban and the other 20 terrorist groups that are aligned with the Taliban terrorist group in order to establish this democratic Afghanistan in the future through military, political, civil means. And we have been making strides and many achievements towards this goal.
Okay, that's fascinating. In that 3 years, what has shifted and changed? Do you think that the resistance front is getting stronger? Are you occupying territory? What is the? I imagine there are other political groups and movements that are opposed to the Taliban as well? Is there a kind of consolidation that's happening? Tell us a bit about kind of those achievements that you referred to over the last 3 years.
So for the past 3 years, of course, on the battlefield, we have been making progress. We have been advancing. When we started on August 15th, 2021, we were only in 2 provinces. So in Panjshir province and in a district in an adjacent province called Andhra Valley. And so we started from a small region in the Hindu Kush Mountains during that period. However, today, as we speak, we are present in over 17 provinces of Afghanistan. We have increased our forces. We have improved our tactics, our overall military strategy. We have basically increased our precision. We have brought down our casualties, and we have been able to very much cause exhaustion on the enemy side. We have created confusion for them. We have successfully challenged them through different means. For example, we have in the past 3 years on numerous occasions liberated districts. However, since we are fighting an unconventional warfare, we haven't sustained control over them. We have improved our forces equipment. For example, in the first year and second year, our forces were unable to launch operations during the night. They didn't have night vision and thermal scopes. But this year, even during the winter, our forces were operating during the night. We had many operations at night, successful ones, and that has been continuing. This year, our fighting has intensified. We are targeting more strategic areas. Our spring offensive started 3 weeks before spring equinox this year, and our first major operation was against the military side of Kabul airport. Most of our attacks so far has been very much successful in attacking the Taliban's facilities, infrastructure, their forces. We have increased our presence and our operations within Kabul city. So just a few hours ago, our forces attacked the Taliban in Kabul's 5th security district, a neighborhood in central Kabul, and there were 3 Taliban casualties. We have very much, we haven't faced any casualties ourselves. One thing that we've been very much careful is to avoid civilian casualties, and fortunately, there has been no civilian casualties. It's very interesting that in all types of warfare, even the most just and righteous one, there is always civilian casualties. However, there is no instance in the last 3 years, especially this year, where our attacks and operations have intensified, where there is civilian casualties. We've only been attacking and operating in areas where there is no civilians. And so it's only the Taliban terrorists and other terrorists who are being attacked.
Mm-hmm. So what you're describing is a guerrilla campaign. So it's not as if there are provinces or cities that we would say are politically liberated or separate, but what you're more describing is you're intensifying a campaign of guerrilla tactics that undermine Taliban control and create the conditions for an eventual kind of liberation. Is that correct?
So, of course, we are pursuing an unconventional war at the moment because we lack external support. There is no support coming from any country. But it doesn't mean that we don't hold territory. We hold territory in the remote valleys of the Hindu Kush Mountains in the northeast. We have our bases, we have our forces, we have our commanders and our rank and file and so forth, which we've shown through videos, through images, and so forth. However, in the numerous provinces, as I said, in the 17 provinces that we operate in today, we cannot have our bases and full-time forces in each one of these provinces. So we have to pursue a more of a guerrilla warfare at the time being, and to prepare for the second phase, which is to liberate and sustain control over districts and provinces, which as every day passes, we are gaining closer to that and moving closer to that. Yet, in order for us to officially move to that phase, we will certainly need external support, which I, as the head of foreign relations for the NRF, have been going everywhere, traveling everywhere, advocating for this righteous cause in order for us to fight our common enemies. Because one thing that is very much clear, Mr. Janice, is that we're not only fighting the enemies of Afghanistan's people, we're fighting the enemies of humanity. It's not only the Taliban terrorist group that we're fighting against. We're fighting against 20 plus terrorist groups. From day one, we have been continuing the global war on terror. Unfortunately, our allies abandoned the global war on terror in August of 2021. It's our forces, it's our people who have been continuing this for the last 3 years. And this is something that has been verified. For example, less than a year ago, the United Nations Security Council, they published a report and verified our claims. They wrote in the report that came out from the United Nations Security Council that the NRF, the National Resistance Front of Afghanistan, is not only fighting the Taliban, but they're fighting against the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, Daesh, and the numerous other regional terrorist groups that have flooded Afghanistan after August 2021. So it is a fight for our for humanity. It's a fight for global security and global stability. And for this reason, the National Resistance Front has to be supported. If we're not supported, and if we're unable to defeat the 20 plus terrorist groups that are present today in Afghanistan, that are being supported and assisted by the Taliban, they are receiving protection by the Taliban, then this threat is going to spread and one day will reach North America. And we've seen this precedent in history.
Yeah.
If there were measures made before 9/11, I'm sure that attack would have been prevented. But Afghanistan was ignored back in the 1990s, and we saw the consequences. Today, it's being ignored once again.
Mm-hmm. So you're the head of foreign relations for the National Resistance Front, which is like a foreign minister, and your role is to talk to people like me and other politicians and everyday citizens around the world, and make the case for what you're trying to do, increase awareness about it, and seek support for it. I think that. Probably, I'm going to guess here that one of the biggest challenges you have, at least talking to people in the West, is they say, "Man, we want to help you. We tried that for 20 years and we didn't succeed. So, what can we possibly do now?" How do you challenge that pessimism from people that maybe think we tried that, the fight's over, there's nothing left to be done?
Well, I wish it was that easy, but I have to remind everyone that, of course, we weren't on the losing side until the United States decided to be on the losing side. Before the negotiations started in 2018, the Taliban didn't control territory inside Afghanistan. The Taliban didn't have the confidence that they have today, and it wasn't basically a war where NATO or a specific country in NATO was facing casualties, was very much on the losing side. We were successful in establishing a democratic government inside Afghanistan. There was a military inside Afghanistan that was well trained, that were fighting all of these terrorist forces. Of course, we had casualties. There were thousands of our forces who were fighting against the Taliban and sacrificed their lives to annihilate this threat that faces all of us. Yet we were able to sustain the political and security order. Yet it basically was challenged when the policies of the U.S. administration changed vis-a-vis Afghanistan, and it led to a vacuum. And the Taliban was able to exploit that vacuum in 2020 and 2021, and they were able to regain power in August 2021. So there were many ways of us preventing the scenario that transpired in Afghanistan if different policies were adopted in 2018 and later years, and we could have prevented this this situation today where Afghanistan is a hub and haven for jihadism, for terrorism, where you have basically jihadists from North Africa to South Asia coalesce in Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. I believe the situation was much more in our favor 5 years ago than it is today. But again, what we're asking is not boots on the ground. We're not asking for any country to return to Afghanistan. The people of Afghanistan are willing and are capable of fighting terrorism inside their own country. We have well-trained forces ourselves. Our forces can very much defeat terrorism if they are supported and assisted by friends outside of Afghanistan. And basically, we have shown this many times. For example, in the 1990s, we continued a resistance for more than 5 years with limited resources. We were the legitimate government of Afghanistan, not the Taliban in the 1990s. And so we're able to replay that once again and to challenge our enemies. In 2001, when the coalition started the fight against the Taliban, basically, it was us who were doing the fighting on the ground with some advisors who came from the West, and Western powers were providing air support. But on the ground, it was our forces who liberated the country. So we, with limited amount of resources that can be provided to us, we will be able to defeat the Taliban. It's not something impossible, and I believe if we defeat them today, we can prevent a catastrophe from happening tomorrow that can affect the lives of not only our people, but the lives of many people around the globe.
Mm-hmm. I personally, I completely agree with your assessment that that the pullout was the factor that changed the game. It wasn't that a Taliban victory was inevitable. It was that the Taliban were continuing an insurgency, but it was but the situation had stabilized to the point where, especially Western forces supporting the Afghan government had not sustained a casualty for years. And yet they still pulled out, despite having a more limited presence in Afghanistan than many other countries where American troops continue to be stationed today. I've often made the comparison to South Korea, right? Nobody describes South Korea as sort of a forever war. Yes. There continue to be American troops in South Korea today, and they play an important reassurance function, promoting peace by deterring aggression, and it would be absurd to say that they are participating in a forever war by being there. They're providing a reassurance function that is sensible and in everybody's interest, and yet somehow the continuing presence in Afghanistan was portrayed differently. Just looking at the hypothetical, though, and I want to kind of move us up to the present and talk about your needs and things you're asking for today, but just kind of that past hypothetical. If you had an American administration or other administrations that were more prepared to stay the course, how much longer would it have taken before their presence was no longer necessary? Was it 5 years? Was it 10 years? Or would you have wanted to see some kind of modest Western presence continuing for a longer period of time?
Well, one thing that I have to make clear is that, of course, Afghanistan's government had its problems, had its shortcomings, and there was many political crises throughout the 20 years. It wasn't, of course, an ideal democracy, yet it needed time to mature, as in every democracy. But, of course, we could have reached the point where NATO forces could have withdrew from Afghanistan. One was a new generation was about to take the torch from the older generation, and a new generation was about to take over the leadership of the country. For 20 years, NATO stayed in Afghanistan. They invested in a new generation. And that generation that went to prestigious universities, who acquired skills, who became highly educated, who could have entered both the civilian government and the military. They didn't really have much time in the past 20 years to have reached the leadership roles that they needed. Yet they needed a bit more time in order to have achieved that. And unfortunately, by the time they started achieving that, our allies started leaving the country, abandoning the country, and abandoning this generation, which most of them today are either stuck in the country or have taken refuge in many other countries. There wasn't much time for this new generation to bring improvements in governance, to bring improvement in the security of the country with the new skills that they acquired and so forth. So this was one matter. If there was more time given to at least this new generation that was rising, we could have seen a better Afghanistan in the future. Second is, of course, political reform within Afghanistan's government. We believe one reason why the government started losing legitimacy, and I myself, I was part of the opposition, so I wasn't part of the government. And so we were asking for reform in the electoral system, reform in the constitution, because as you may know, Mr. Janice, Afghanistan is a highly diverse country. It's a country that lacks any majority, so no ethnic group constitutes a majority in the country. Everyone is a minority. And what we were asking was a better distribution of power between Kabul, the capital, and the provinces and other levels of governments. So people could see themselves in decision-making and policy-making. Basically, all power was concentrated in Kabul in the hands of one individual, the president, for the last 20 years. And this didn't really allow democracy to mature, to very much take root in our society. One thing that was clear was that Afghanistan's people supported democracy. In the 20 years that we had the Democratic Republic, we never saw a mass uprising against democracy, against the constitution, against the republic. The Taliban were working day and night to very much provoke an uprising, even on a village level, meaning a whole village rising up against the republic. They were never able to achieve that. Basically showing that the people of Afghanistan embraced democracy after 2001. This is something going back to history. When the coalition forces entered Afghanistan in 2001, the mission was to defeat terrorism, Taliban and Al-Qaeda. It was Afghanistan's people, Afghanistan's political forces that proposed to the coalition forces that, since you guys are here, support our aspiration for a democratic government, which Mr. Bush back then and other world leaders accepted it, and they started supporting the democratic process in Afghanistan. So Afghanistan's people have been fighting for democracy for decades, even before the intervention happened in 2001. And we're still fighting for democracy even after we were abandoned in August 2021. So this is an aspiration that we've been fighting for decades, that our people supported in the 20 years. And basically, if we had a bit more time, we could have sustained the political order that came into being with a bit of reform and with a new generation coming to power and leading the country.
Yeah, that's a really fascinating perspective, and I didn't know that you had been part of the opposition before, so that's kind of an interesting role for you. We talk about in our system the loyal opposition, right? That believes in the system but is still calling for change. So, tell me a bit more about. I was interested in your comments about decentralization and diversity. You've mentioned this a few times, in terms of setting out your goals for Afghanistan are democratic and also decentralized. Has the National Resistance Front really been able to draw in people that represent the ethnic, religious, cultural diversity of Afghanistan, and how is that? How are those regional differences expressing themselves in the context of your movement today?
So, of course, as I mentioned, Afghanistan is a highly diverse country. It's a multicultural, multinational state. It's not a nation state. We're made up of different national identities, different ethnic groups, or religious groups, and that is the beauty of our country. And we believe we should embrace our diversity as much as possible. The Taliban are doing the complete opposite. They're trying to erase this diversity. First, they're trying to completely erase women from public life, erase women from and deprive women from all their rights. So that's one. Two is they're going after different ethnic and religious communities inside the country. Afghanistan, since the Taliban returned, Afghanistan lost its Jewish community, is losing its Hindu and Sikh community. So for the first time in Afghanistan's history, in our few thousand years of history, we're losing our religious diversity. This is a sad moment in our history where, unfortunately, as every day passes, it's becoming a reality that Afghanistan is losing this diversity, which we've had for thousands of years. And of course, we, even within the Muslim community, we have different sects. We have the Sunnis, we have the 12er Shiites, we have the Shia Ismailis. And so there's a lot of diversity inside the country. And in our perspective, the only way to bring lasting peace in the country and for a peaceful coexistence to come into being is to adopt multiculturalism or pluralism, and for all these identities to coexist peacefully, to have equal rights, to be able to be promoted by each of its communities, and for no one to have the right to erase someone else's identity. So this is something that we believe in. This is something that we've been stating for decades. The leader of the National Resistance Front, which I want to show a copy of that book right now, has written a book recently. It came out a week ago. It's called In the Name of My Father, Struggling for freedom in Afghanistan. And in this book, the leader of the National Resistance Front, Mr. Ahmad Massoud, he writes a few chapters on this matter, on pluralism, multiculturalism, and decentralization in Afghanistan. And so one is, we believe the government in Afghanistan should adopt a policy of multiculturalism instead of promoting one ethnic nationalism or one specific community in the country. And on the other hand, in order for everyone to see themselves in the political community and to see themselves in power, power has to be distributed equally throughout the country. We need decentralization. We need to empower the provinces. We need to empower the districts. And one reason why the government started losing legitimacy in Afghanistan was because it was moving in the completely opposite direction in the 20 years. Afghanistan's last president, Mr. Ashraf Ghani, was concentrating and centralizing power not only in Kabul, but in the presidential palace. He was taking authority even away from key ministries in the government. He was making decisions for the most remote village in Afghanistan, and basically was trying to hold on to power as much as possible instead of sharing it. And so this created the sense of marginalization in many parts of the country. And people saw themselves outside of decision making, which as time passed, the overall state started losing legitimacy in the eyes of the people. And we saw that in the last election that happened in 2019. So what we believe is democracy should be reestablished. However, it should be a reformed democracy this time, based on Afghanistan's realities. It should be a decentralized democracy. It should be a democracy based on pluralism and multiculturalism instead of a specific nationalism, which was pursued in the last 20 years. So we do present something different. And of course, as you've asked about the National Resistance Front, we are a diverse group. We have people from different ethnic communities, from different religious communities, both in our military wing and our political wing. There are people who are serving as the head of different committees that we have, who represent different communities inside Afghanistan from different walks of life. And besides the National Resistance Front, one thing that we've done is we've created a political platform in the heart of Europe, in Vienna, Austria, for the past 2 years. It's called the Vienna Process for a Democratic Afghanistan. And so this space and this platform basically allows Afghanistan's different political and civil groups to come together in order to start thinking about a democratic alternative for the future of the country, not only thinking, but preparing for that alternative. We've had 3 rounds so far. Our last one was in December of 2023. The more than 50 political and civil groups, they drew a roadmap on how to achieve a democratic alternative. It was ratified by all of these groups, and we're having our next one next month. So towards the end of June, we're having the 4th round, which there will be around 70 different groups, and all of these groups will be reviewing the roadmap and will be moving forward based on the roadmap and very much preparing for a vacuum that might come into being in the future of the country.
Now, in terms of what you want, in terms of what you're looking for, I wonder if you could speak sort of directly and specifically to that, the kind of support you'd be looking for. You mentioned not boots on the ground, but I assume weapons and equipment of various kinds, what would your ask be of Western governments?
Well, of course, Mr. Jennings, as you may know, when NATO left Afghanistan in August 2021, they left 21 terrorist groups with $6 billion worth of arms, munitions, and equipment. All of them are Western made, and specifically American made. And what has happened in the past 3 years is that not only the Taliban, but many other terrorist groups, including ISKP, Al-Qaeda, have equipped themselves with these weapons. We have videos of Al-Qaeda fighters coming to the north with these American-made weapons and saying, we're waging jihad against the National Resistance Front, against Panjshir, against other regions that were present. And so this just shows the depth of this problem that we're facing in Afghanistan, and not only inside Afghanistan. Right now, these weapons are ending up in places like Kashmir, in the Middle East, and so forth. So Afghanistan is an open black market for American-made weapons today. And so what we need is whatever resource that is needed to defeat terrorism. It's not only something specific, it's whatever is needed to defeat these forces. Inside Afghanistan, of course, it's military resources, different types of resources, lethal and non-lethal, for the democratic forces of Afghanistan to find an edge, to gain an edge in the battlefield. Because, of course, we are challenging them, we are fighting them, but we don't have an edge right now. Because, as I mentioned, they are the ones who have all the weapons and munitions that were left behind. Outside of Afghanistan, we need political support. We need different governments, especially democratic governments throughout the world. They have to support democratic forces like us and other political forces from Afghanistan who are against the current situation inside Afghanistan and who are supportive of a democratic future for Afghanistan. For us to have a voice in different societies outside of Afghanistan, to allow us to build our political forces, to very much to mobilize our political forces wherever we are, and to have the space that we need, which unfortunately we are not receiving enough political support from our friends, whether it's in Europe, whether it's by many regional countries who share our vision for the future of Afghanistan, or from countries in North America. And so what we ask from our friends and from democratic people from countries who support democracy is to, if they're not ready for the military assistance, to provide military assistance, for them to at least provide political support for us. Instead of engaging with the Taliban, they should engage with us. What's happening today is we're seeing engagement with a terrorist group, engagement with a group that is basically allowing different radical Islamists and jihadists to use Afghanistan as a base against everyone. We are seeing engagement with a group that is basically terrorizing women and basically erasing women from Afghanistan society. But we're seeing that the same countries are ignoring Afghanistan's democratic forces. Basically, this policy of appeasement should stop, and a more realistic policy where we accept that the Taliban aren't going to change, that this group is going to stay as terrorists, that this group is going to stay anti-women and anti-girls, they are going to stay anti-civilization, and that it's time to find to find alternatives inside Afghanistan, to find the democratic forces that can bring change in the country and liberate the country.
Mm-hmm. So just building on that discussion of the sort of the current political realities within the Taliban, some people in the West really like to get drawn to these narratives of kind of the moderate within, right? We heard this a lot in terms of the Iranian regime, for example, where they have very much stage-managed elections, but in spite of the fact that all of the authority remains in the hands of the supreme leader, that you would have Western commentators sort of speculating about whether the regime-approved moderates or the regime-approved hardliners would have the upper hand, even though this was a kind of a fictitious managed process. And how do you respond to that sort of moderate within narrative? People saying, well, there are some people inside the Taliban who might be actually inclined in a more progressive direction.
Well, if there were moderates within the Taliban, we would have seen change in some part of the country, because the Taliban are divided into different factions, and each faction controls a different part of Afghanistan. At least, if there was any moderate faction within this terrorist group, we would have seen at least one province or a few provinces allow women to attain education or to enter the workforce, re-enter the workforce, of course, and to have allowed people to have rights. But we haven't seen that. Basically, we see uniformity throughout the country, that everyone follows the orders of the Taliban's supreme leader, and no one is willing to challenge that. Of course, they have their differences, but the differences is tactical. The difference isn't based on ideology. They all share the same ideology. We've been engaging with the Taliban, the different factions of the Taliban, for years now, for decades. We know them better than anyone else. And one thing that I can tell you is basically all of them are radicals, and that they share the same ideology. Basically, their competition today, the competition between the different factions, is over power, is over resources. Who's going to become the next supreme leader of the Taliban? Whether it's Sirajuddin Haqqani, whether it's Yaqub, the son of Mullah Omar, or it's someone else within the Kandahari faction. So it's all about power. It's not about a difference of ideology. This is one thing that has been sold by some countries and some lobbyists in favor of the Taliban. But now that 3 years have passed, we know that it's a farce. It's not.
And what about some of these other terrorist organizations? Are they actively fighting with each other for power? Are there ideological differences between Daesh, Al Qaeda, Taliban, or are they purely sort of different names on the same basic view of the world?
Well, basically all of them, as I mentioned about the factions of the Taliban, when it comes to these terrorist groups, all of them share the same ideology. And it's a bit more complex than what's being portrayed in the media. On the one hand, of course, there is around 21, 22 terrorist groups within Afghanistan today. The Taliban, Al Qaeda, and all terrorist groups except for ISKP are on the one side. So you have Al Qaeda, you have groups like the Taliban movement of Pakistan, you have Ansarullah, you have the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan, you have Jaish al-Adl, you have ETIM, you have Lashkar Taiba, you have Al Qaeda South Asian branch, you have representatives of Al Shabaab and Boko Haram in Kabul. And so there is around 21, 22 of these terrorist groups that are fully aligned with the Taliban, and they've declared allegiance to the Taliban's leader. So basically, they believe that the Taliban supreme leader isn't only the leader of Afghanistan, that he's the leader of the wider Muslim world. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, you have ISIS or ISKP, The difference between those terrorist groups and ISKP is nothing when it comes to ideology. Both share the same ideology. They share the same tactics. They're brutal when it comes to their tactics. What ISKP has done in Iraq and Syria is the same thing that the Taliban and Al-Qaeda have done inside Afghanistan. So we don't really see much of a difference, even when it comes to their tactic. What we see is difference in terminology, and two is competition over power. So ISKP says, well, we have to declare a caliphate. The Muslim world should be part of the same caliphate. We should remove national boundaries, and all Muslims have to pledge allegiance to this Islamic caliphate. The Taliban says, no, it should be an emirate, an Islamic emirate. And it's the Amir al-Mu'mineen, or the commander of the faithful, that leads all Muslims. So basically, it's a fight between two terminologies. One saying it should be a caliphate, the other says emirate. But both are against national boundaries. Both say we have to control all Muslims. Both say that our leader is the leader of all Muslims. So ideologically, it's the same. It's the same jihadist ideology. For example, the Taliban's supreme leader just 2 months ago came out with an audio recording. In his message, he said, jihad isn't going to end. It hasn't ended after 2021. That we are still hostile towards those who we were fighting against, and that our true enemy is democracy, is universal values, which he labeled as Western values, and so forth. So he's using the same talking points as Al-Qaeda, as ISKP, and the other terrorist groups. When it comes to the competition between the Taliban and ISKP, it's not black and white. It's much more gray. It's much more complex than what is being portrayed. In some areas, we see cooperation between the Taliban and ISKP. In some places, we see competition. And what has happened in the last 1.5 years is, of course, because there's factional differences and there's rifts between the Taliban, we see that ISKP has very much exploited these rifts, and they've infiltrated within Taliban ranks. So we see ISKP elements within the Taliban's intelligence, within the Taliban's rank and file, within many of the Taliban's different factions. So ISKP, even though it is challenging the Taliban's leader, is present within the Taliban at the same time. And we're seeing some levels of cooperation at times in different areas between these groups. And of course, at times the Taliban use ISKP to go against their opponents. For example, some of our forces, it was 2 weeks ago, because they were exposed, the only border that is open to Afghanistan's people to take refuge is Iran, because the border with Pakistan and Central Asia are completely closed. So our forces were forced to take refuge in Iran. And the Taliban knew that they went to Iran. They worked with the Iranian authorities. They gave false information to the Iranian government that there's fighters from ISKP that have entered Iranian soil. The Iranian government went and arrested our forces. So they're using this narrative of ISKP to go against democratic forces, to go against the National Resistance Front, to go against other resistance fronts like the Afghanistan Freedom Front and so forth, by using ISKP as a label against us. But when it comes to these terrorist forces, all of them are the same. And of course, for more information about the ideology and basically the commonalities between these terrorist forces, as I mentioned before, this book, In the Name of My Father, Struggling for Freedom in Afghanistan by Ahmad Massoud, the leader of the NRF, very much explains the complex situation when it comes to not only international terrorism within Afghanistan, but beyond Afghanistan, throughout the Muslim world.
And we will
is a threat to all of us.
we'll put a link for the book in the show notes as well. Some people will be watching this on YouTube, but others will be listening to the audio on Apple Podcasts and other places that they get those podcasts. So we'll make sure there's a link. I wanted to make sure I got in a question about regional players as well. So we've talked a lot about kind of the West and its relationship with Afghanistan, but you've also got there's sort of this process happening between the Taliban and China. Russia's a player, India, Pakistan, Iran, right on your border. If you could share a little bit about kind of in your roles as the lead for foreign affairs, how these key regional powers are kind of playing into what's happening with Afghanistan, and what kind of dialogue are you at the NRF able to have with them?
So because of the situation today and the vacuum that was created after 2021, many regional countries have found an opportunity to pursue geopolitical games within Afghanistan. And so we've been seeing this and witnessing this throughout the last 3 years. Of course, different countries are supporting the warring factions of the Taliban for their own interests. And this is a destabilizing policy. Many countries are facing more of a threat. For example, Central Asia is feeling an imminent threat emanating from Afghanistan against its security, especially countries like Tajikistan that share a long border with Afghanistan. And the Taliban are very much strengthening terrorist forces from Central Asia, giving them equipment and training and basically arming them to infiltrate Central Asian republics such as Tajikistan and Uzbekistan. The same with Pakistan. We're seeing that the TTP has increased its attacks against Pakistan in the past 3 years. They have been arming the TTP and allowing the TTP to enter Pakistan through Afghanistan. And it's destabilizing the situation in Pakistan, a nuclear state. And at the same time, we see countries like China who have been signing contracts, oil contract and many contracts to extract Afghanistan's natural resources. Our messaging to these countries has been the Taliban is in Afghanistan's legitimate country, legitimate government. It's a terrorist group. It doesn't represent Afghanistan's people. And they have no right to sell Afghanistan's natural resources. And so any country that signs these contracts with the Taliban and make deals with the Taliban will face the consequences in the future. None of these contracts and agreements will be respected by a legitimate government of Afghanistan that has the support and backing of Afghanistan's people. And so this is something that we've sent a message to everyone, that whoever supports the Taliban, whoever legitimizes the Taliban, whoever strengthens the Taliban is going to face the consequences in the future. That the people of Afghanistan are not going to forget and forgive anyone who tries to strengthen a terrorist group that is terrorizing and brutalizing a whole population today.
Mr. Desari, you've been very generous with your time. Thank you for joining us today. I'll ask one final question and give the final word